After 10 way too long years of waiting, it is finally here. This is the Noctua NH-D15 G2, the second generation of Noctua's new flagship cooler. There is a lot to be said about this cooler, and I'm not Noctua. I can afford to postpone my stuff for like 29 times, so let's just get started. The new generation comes in 3 different variations. HBC or high base convexity version, tailor-made for LGA 1700 sockets, a LBC or low base convexity, made for AM5 or anything that can pretty much guarantee a very flat CPU, and a regular standard version. Now for this video I don't want to get too deep into the differences between them, but in a nutshell, HBC takes into account that new Intel chips are built like carton, LBC requires like really straight IHSs, aka AM5. But to cut it short, just take the standard one. There are performance differences, and there will be a second video, it's on its way, focusing only on that difference, but it's really not like you are buying 3 different coolers. It's the same cooler where the base just has a minimally different shape. That's really it. It may give you a degree here and there, but it's not a revolution. Hence, I will absolutely recommend to just get the standard version, because even if you would say I want the HPC because I am always running on Intel chips, what if 15th gen Intel doesn't bend? Well, then you're kind of screwed. Hence, the regular one will just be the safe bet. On that note, installation material-wise, they are all exactly the same. Every D15 G2 comes in the same pretty brown box, includes the cooler with both fans pre-installed and a care package containing a screwdriver, 2 low noise adapters, a splitter, some thermal paste and cleaning wipes, as well as installation hardware for AM4, 5 and LGA 1851, so 15th gen is already in there, as well as the older ones dating all the way back to LGA 1150. And they even include the thermal guard for AM5. And the mandatory Noctua case badge. And all of that is the case for every version. So yes, even if you buy the one that is made for LGA or with LGA 1700 in mind, you can still mount that on top of an AM5 CPU at the cost of potentially a mini fraction of its performance. And Noctua might send the cops after you, but you can do whatever you want. Standing on the table, the G2 is even more impressive than what we had before, with the fans installed at the point where they wouldn't contribute to additional height, so aligned with the outsticking ends of the heat pipes. The cooler measures 163.5mm in height, 150 in width and 152 in depth. And that was with the fans, or with the front fan, pushed down significantly, and with significantly I mean 25.1mm high ram sticks. So no, that is not going to happen. The right fan obviously protrudes above every possible ram slot, so you will have to keep that in mind. But the calculation is pretty straightforward from here. Any ram higher than 25mm will add to that 163.5 total cooler height. So if you come with, let's say, a pair of Corsair Vengeance RGB DDR5 RAM sticks, they are 44mm high, so they will add 90mm to that 163.5, so the whole cooler will end up being 182.5mm high. On a side note, the heatsink itself is also protruding above the first RAM slot, so there is a physical limit of 55.6mm if you are going to use all 4 RAM slots. Though to be honest, I'm not aware of 55mm or 55 or higher millimeter RAM. I don't know if they even exist right now. But back to the Dual Tower Heatsink with its outsticking 8 heat pipes. Yes, in a time where the industry has started to shift towards using 7 heat pipes, Noctua wanted to be extra fancy and gave us 8. Almost all of them are aligned in a somewhat straight line, with only the last ones being displaced slightly towards the center. We counted a total of 58 fins, which considering the height isn't extraordinarily dense, and on the outside of the cooler the last 7 rows are cut off, probably to not get into contact with the first RAM slot. Something that I don't quite get is why that row isn't going across the whole cooler. Like, it ends before reaching the last 3 heat pipes, and the only reason I could think of is that on some random motherboard out there, that thing, or the motherboard has the most giant VRM heatsink that even exists, and this might have caused problems. So this seems like a solution to me. Apart from that weird heatsink situation, we can also see that the cooler is offset, but not like we are used to. Usually you see coolers being pushed towards the back, so away from the RAM slots to give them some breathing room. But as stated on multiple occasions, offsetting heat pipes by bending them left or right isn't particularly good for performance. So Noctua's approach here is to just not do it and have them go straight up, but the heatsink itself is slightly shifted towards the PCIe slots. You can see it best from the bottom, but you can also see it from the top. There is slightly more heatsink left towards the top of the cooler than towards the bottom. And to finish off this giant piece of aluminum, in the bottom we got one of the biggest copper nickel plated bases I have seen so far at 44.4 by 51.9 millimeters. That thing is massive, especially compared to the original D15. However, not everything has become just massive in comparison. Yes, the new one has become slightly taller and it has a base that just screams compensator, but one of the two towers has become 45 millimeters wide, opposed to the dual 50s that the original one rocked. In contrast to that, what has been the lowest part of the heatsink has now been stretched to cover the whole cooler, and a new lowest part appeared. So it's not really like the 5mm thickness are missing in any way. But let's now talk a bit about the main attraction of this cooler, except of course for the 8 heat pipes, that's also an attraction. These are the Noctua NF-A14x25r, or to be more specific, the G2 PWM SX2 PP. Yeah, that's just impossible to pronounce differently, but it stands for push-pull. These are special versions made specifically for push-pull operations. By default, they should be running at 1500 RPM, but because Noctua likes to research stuff that everybody is just going to copy in 6 months anyway, they found out that having two fans run behind each other at the exact same speed can lead to undesired acoustic phenomena. Hence, there is now a PPA fan and a PPB fan, both offset by about 25 RPM from that original 1500. Spinning at max, these are pushing up to 91.5 CFM at up to 2.56 mm of H2O, and compared to the original A4T fans, yeah, that's everything here is an update. Now, I don't want to spend the next 10 minutes talking about the fans, because I could. No, I want to leave that for the dedicated review once they come out. But in short, Noctua pushed a lot of new tech into these. We got a 9-blade design, but each of them is bent twice. First, they make a quite moderate curve away from the central hub, and then they make a sharp turn until almost reaching the border. Noctua calls this progressive bend impeller, and according to them, this pushes more air towards the outer parts of the blade or the outer parts of the fan, which in turn helps performance. But the impeller doesn't do it alone, because these things here are not designed. They are specifically made to help the whole concept of the progressive bend impeller. They are called centrifugal turbulators. Noctua is on a wild run here with buzzwords. Anyway, then we also got winglets. Yes, like the planes. There are mini outsticking ends on each blade. And of course there is LCP. The impeller is made out of LCP, giving it that necessary strength to make that ultra tight tip clearance possible. Other than that, we got the usual Noctua level of mini optimizations, stepped inlet design, flow acceleration channels, the usual Noctua stuff. And to finish them off, we also got some changes on the motor. It's still Noctua's SSO2 bearing, but everything else has been upgraded with something that can keep the fan spinning at higher speeds, even if the fan is facing resistance, like on a heatsink or a radiator. All in all, extremely interesting fans, and I can't wait to have the actual product once it comes out, but they are not necessarily quieter. Ignoring that basically everything about these has improved, the fan itself has not become quieter in the sense of dB. The sound has just become different. Just listen to the noise samples of both the old NH-D15 and the new one. In terms of my dB meter, the difference is 0.1 dB, so it's really not like it's worse or anything. It's marginally at best, but the frequency has definitely shifted quite a lot. But there is a lot more to which we will get later in the benchmark section. But before we get there, let's talk about installation. To get this D15 G2 going on Intel, we need to take the provided backplate and shove the Intel screws through the holes. The triangle pointed outwards for LGA 1851 and 1700, inside for everything else. And then secure them on the other side with the washers. And be sure to have the screw stick out on the side where it says facing the motherboard. After positioning it behind the motherboard, we need to use the blue spacers for LGA 1851 and 1700 and black for the older ones, and install the Intel retention brackets on top with the ends pointing towards the CPU. And yes, this is 360 reversible, so you can have the cooler face whatever direction you want. And then screw everything down using the thumb screws. Over on AMD, we need to remove the original retention brackets and replace them with the spacers. And then we got these brackets. They are fairly easy to understand. North is going above the CPU, south is going below, or just follow the arrow. This is pretty much idiot-proof, unlike a certain cup holder. Anyway, we got two sets of holes here. A regular one centering the cooler above the CPU and another one pushing it down by 7mm. If you're running any AM5 CPU, just go with the 7 or minus 7mm holes. This is because what you are actually trying to cool is not in the center, it is sitting like towards the bottom, hence pushing the cooler down makes everything perform better. And for APUs it apparently doesn't work, so if you are rocking something like a 5600G, use the regular holes. And then screw the brackets down using the included screws. And by the way, all of the screws of the G2 are Torx, but you can do everything using the included Noctua screwdriver. And use the thermal paste guard. You will thank yourself later. And from there, remove the central fan using the clips, slap the cooler on top and screw it down. And while you have the central fan out, don't forget to remove this piece of protective paper in the center. I really don't want to find out how it would sound if you just don't. And with that out of the way, let's take a closer look at what this 8 heat pipe behemoth can actually do. For our first round of testing, we benchmarked this new NH-D15 G2 on top of an Intel 3900K and used 3 presets, 120, 250 and 320 watts. Basically gaming working, and what the hell are you doing? And important to mention here for today, we benchmarked the HBC version, so the LGA 1700 specific for the Intel benchmarks. At 120 watts going through the socket, the G2 managed to keep the chip at 32.6 degrees C above ambient. This puts it very high on the chart, but not at the very top. As far as air coolers are concerned, the Deep Cool Assassin 4, Darkrock Elite and Phantom Spirit 120 are marginally higher. Compared to the previous generation, we are looking at a 0.9 degrees C improvement. Doesn't sound like much, but this is also only 120 watts, so the 3900K is barely doing anything anyway. And on the bigger picture, the new D15 managed to land roughly in the middle of the whole graph, but at the higher end if only air coolers are concerned. But the 8 heat pipes are not the only thing that got improvements. The fans are just as important, so let's take a look at the noise. The noise to performance graph for the new D15 looks very impressive, but not perfect. From start to finish, the new D15 performs very similarly to a Darkrock Elite. It peaks ahead of the Be Quiet one a couple of times throughout the whole run, and towards the high end it starts to fall very slightly behind. Though keep in mind that this difference is like 0.3 of a single degree, so they are performing somewhat the same. Compared to the original D15, we can definitely see an improvement. The changes to the fans and heatsink help the D15 to partially offset the new one by a full degree. From start to finish, they are pretty much parallel as they become quieter and harder. But as far as 120 watts on a 3900K are concerned, the Phantom Spirit 120 is still the winner. Its ratio is yet to be defeated. But that was only 120 watts, and pushing 120 watts through 8 heatsinks just seems kinda silly, so let's push it a bit higher. At 250 watts, the D15 landed a bit higher, with now solely the Darkrock Elite being left above it by a fraction of a degree, and at 61.9 degrees C above ambient, we start seeing some real improvements compared to the previous generation, which landed almost 3 degrees below. Also interesting to note here is that the new D15 lands very close to a bunch of 360 AIOs. That is saying more about the AIOs than it is about the D15, but interesting to see what air coolers can do nowadays. On the bigger picture though, the D15 G2 definitely got better as the heat went up. The Assassin 4 and Phantom Spirit both started to fall behind in comparison, and the distance between good and very good air coolers started to become bigger. The corresponding noise to performance graph for 250 watts was a very big surprise. As a reminder, this is the corner that you want to be closest to. This is as cold as possible and as quiet as possible. And from 100% fan speed down to 70, the new D15 smashed the 250 watts workload, outperforming every air cooler we are comparing it today. Below that point, it starts to fade in between the Phantom Spirit from Thermalright and the Be Quiet Darkrogue Elite. Compared to the previous generation D15, we now see a slightly bigger shift towards a colder operation. Now the shift is about 2 to 3 times bigger and becomes slowly smaller as the fans on both coolers starts to spin slower. So at 250 watts, excellent results. The best we have seen so far towards the high end, and one of the best 3 when things need to be closer to noise floor. Over on 320 watts, Noctua is finally present, where previously the D15 didn't manage to survive 320 watts permanently. The new one definitely did. And here keep in mind that we allow the CPU to go up to 110 degrees before we stop the test. All the actually achieved numbers are still above ambient, but except for AIOs and only a very few coolers or few air coolers, most contestants are just done at this point. But not the G2. At 82.7 degrees C above ambient, Noctua's newest flagship took the crown as the best air cooler on top of an Intel chip. Be it only by a fraction of a degree, but it's the first spot. The noise to performance graph for 320 watts looks very weird for air coolers, it always does, because we can get like 2, maybe 3 measurements until the CPU hits that 110 degrees C threshold, which is why the lines look more like smudges. But from start to finish, the D15 G2 smudge was the closest towards the bottom right corner. It's a bit ahead of the Darkrogue Elite, and compared to the Phantom Spirit or Assassin 4, the distance is pretty big. So on top of an Intel chip, the new D15 G2 is definitely a beast, but it needs power to shine. What we saw is that if you are barely doing anything, the G2 mixes with other high-end coolers, but as you push the load higher and higher and higher, it starts to drift apart, becoming the best in max performance, but most importantly at 250 watts, its noise to performance towards the high end is the best by quite the margin. So if you have, let's say, a 14700K and you are doing a lot with it, the D15 G2 seems to be like the best option as of now. Over to AMD. For the first time, we are now also benchmarking all of our coolers on top of an AMD system, or a 7950X3D to be exact. The new system hasn't been up for longer than a week now, and the video in which we build it and we talk about it isn't even out yet. But because this cooler is so important to the industry, I thought it's necessary to have the benchmarks in here, so I just skipped ahead and included the benchmarks without telling you that we built the machine. As a short explanation, cooling down a 7000 series AMD chip is a very different thing compared to any other AMD chip or Intel chip. We got that whole thing where the CPU will try to stay at 95 degrees C, and because we are specifically cooling down a 7950X3D, TJ Max is even lower, not even mentioning that we now got 3D cache, which changes things drastically. Anyway, there will be a video about that later, but for today, what we are doing is have our 7950X3D use PBO, a -10 curve, and a TJ Max of 85 degrees. And then we hit it with an all-core workload. And from there we will check if the cooler is capable of preventing the chip from reaching that 85 degrees. And yes, some coolers can do it. That's one graph. But the bigger picture is achieved average clock speed across the whole chip. And because it's a 3D chip, half of the cores will run slightly faster than the other half, but we average that over the whole chip to have a single number to work with. And from there we make the fans of the cooler spin slower and slower and note down the clock speed that the chip can achieve to create a noise to performance graph. But before we start, for AMD we used the LBC version, so the one tailor-made for AM5 chips. Spinning at max, the new G2 did manage to prevent that 85 degrees from happening, be it only by 0.4, but it happened. And doing so allowed the chip to stay at 5011 MHz. With all of the coolers spinning at max, the differences at the top might only be marginal, but you can see a trend here and determine which cooler allows the chip to maintain a higher speed. And sorry for the short list here, I only had a few days to do this and this is what I could do. so the list will expand with every video. Slowly lowering the fan speed made the chip clog itself down further and further. And how this graph works is that a given cooler can maintain a given clock speed at the cost of a certain noise level. Making the fan spin slower and slower will make the chip perform slower and slower. But everything becomes quieter at the same time. The spot you want to be in is in the top left corner, essentially maintaining that all-core 5 GHz workload at noise floor, which none of them can do. So you can take, let's say, 38 dB, and you can see how each cooler will perform at that noise level. The G2 will keep the chip at exactly 5 GHz, and then a few megahertz below that we got the original one, then followed by the Peerless Assassin, and so on until it reaches the Dark Rock Elite, which is clearly the biggest loser when mounted on top of an AMD 7000 CPU. But anywhere you put it, the new G2 keeps an excellent ratio throughout the whole run. From 100% fan speed to almost noise floor, it kept the highest performance per dB. And it only fell behind the Thermalright Phantom Spirit at a very brief moment. And in case you wonder why everything is just plummeting down at the very left of the graph, that's because we got a 35.5 dB noise floor with our dB meter. And because all of the coolers that we have benchmarked here are like really good, the 30, 40 and sometimes 50% of the max fan speed are basically noise floor. Hence everything will become a line going straight down at 35.5 dB. I'm working on better equipment. But back to AMD 7000 X3D testing. The best air cooler. By max, cause it actually did it, and by noise to performance. Who would have thought the crown for air coolers is back in Austria? On performance, I'm not aware of any air cooler that can maintain a better noise to performance ratio, especially across both platforms. Both AMD and Intel are very well cooled by the G2. But it's not like this is always going to be the best option. As seen on the 120 watts workload, there are instances where the D15 G2 becomes just too much oversized, where it mixes with other coolers, sometimes even losing a bit. But if you are on a high-end system and you're pushing 2, maybe even 300 watts through a small little socket, as far as air coolers go, either it is one of the best or it is keeping the best ratio. So congrats to Noctua. 10 years worth of waiting seem to have paid off. That said, not everything is perfect about this cooler. And for the low price point of your firstborn, I even get to be picky today. All of the fins on the heatsink are soldered to the pipes. Great for performance, but it is not great enough. Under some circumstances, you will start to hear incredibly annoying sounds. What this seems to be is vibrations of the first few rows of fins. And this is just, it is incredibly annoying. I only got to discover this because I had the fans mounted at the very bottom and they were running at full speed. And you can make the issue smaller by just lifting them up until the point where the rubber of the fans will start to touch the first few rows of the fins, or the upper rows of the fins. And yes, most of the sounds comes from the top one. And you can actually make it stop by just touching it. I am fully against saying just mount the fan higher and higher to solve the issue. Because you would need to mount the fan higher than the minimum requirement, making the cooler higher than the 168 millimeters from the spec sheet. Now if you experience it, if you have that issue, of course, if you can do it, mount the fan higher, have the rubber touch the upper fin, and the problem is solved. Of course you should do it. But this needs to be addressed in a different way than just saying everybody raise the fan. In fact, I would try a different solution. Instead of changing anything about the cooler, Noctua could also step in and change the rubber on the corners of the fans, specifically the ones that are facing the radiator. What they could do is change that rubber so that it also covers the place where the fan clips are touching the fan. If you do that, the fan or the rubber around that fan on the heatsink side will always be in contact with the upper fin, completely solving the issue and not having changed anything about the cooler or actually also about the fan. It's just a different rubber. Another issue I have is with the washers that Noctua includes in every version. These are in there in case you're using the standard version and you got an LGA 1700 CPU. And these are supposed to be mounted underneath the pre-existing ILM. So you unmount it, put the washer on the hole, and then you reinstall the original ILM. Good luck. It's a horrible experience and I absolutely wouldn't do it. Just get a contact frame. Easier and better. Another issue I have is where the PWM cable comes out for the fans. Because if it is mounted as it is intended out of the box, you will have it like this, making the PWM cable of the front fan or both fans come out in the bottom. And if you think about it, if you're using all of your RAM, or even if you're using only 2 sticks, this will come out exactly above the second RAM slot, which in turn means that you need to mount the fan even higher than you should have if the cable wasn't there, which is... And to avoid this issue, what they could have done is make the cable come out on the opposite side and just slightly higher, at a point where it just doesn't touch the RAM under all circumstances. Now, of course, you could also cut whatever is keeping that wire in and then reroute it a bit. You can play around with that, but that's not the obvious way to go, and this could have been slightly better thought through. But I am also a bit nitpicky about the naming scheme. I don't mind the G2, I think it sounds cool, but I hate how they did the whole HBC, LBC thing. I get why Noctua made different versions, optimizing is what they do, but this is going to confuse so many people. Even on Amazon, we got the recommended for AMD AM5 and LGA 1700 standard edition, and then we got the specialized one for AM5 and AM4, and a specialized one for LGA 1700. So okay, I'm building on a 13700K. Do I use the recommended one or the specialized one? And try putting yourself into the mind of somebody who doesn't know as much about these things. Or just be honest, how often have you been called and asked a question that somebody could have answered himself with a 20-second Google search? They won't go. They just won't. They will call the tech buddy who will just tell them to get the standard version. What they could also have done is not call it HBC, LBC, but like AM5 and Intel. Just to make it like really easy, and then people would immediately know what to get. A better naming scheme would be generic one, AM5 one, LGA 1700 one. That everybody would understand immediately. But we have LBC, HBC, and yeah, recommended. Now on the flip side of this, I am very impressed by how Noctua is handling the mounting mechanics thing. Because with every version, they include every piece of mounting hardware. That's impressive. And that solves so many problems, because even if somebody would get the wrong cooler, it will still be a good solution. And you still have the mounting hardware for it. It might not be the most optimized solution, but you can always make it work with what Noctua includes in the box. As a product, of course, I recommend the NH-D15 G2. It is one of, if not the most impressive air cooler I have seen so far. Especially the fans are impressive. Performance-wise, it is absolutely amazing, especially once the heat load is high enough, and it doesn't really matter which platform it is used on. And with the 6 years warranty and Noctua's excellent track record to maintain compatibility for many years down the line, I don't see how you could go wrong with a cooler like this for your next build. Now, I would use this on a 7950, 7950X3D, no problem. 14700K, still no problem, of course. But me personally, I wouldn't mount this on top of a 4900K. The G2 can make a 4900K survive, or at least it can maintain a 320 watts workload, but it is barely keeping on. And I prefer to have oversized cooling solutions for my build, so I personally wouldn't do it, but you can. And what about the price? Right here and now, a G2 will cost you 150 euros. Every version, that is. And that is not an affordable price. It's between 45 and 35 euros more expensive right now than the previous version. And out of all of the coolers we compared it to today, the closest competitor would be the Dogrook Elite, which is still 50 bucks less. So yeah, if you want to get that noise to performance ratio at 250 watts, that's going to cost you a lot. Now, to be honest, I do not believe that the price is unreasonable. It's definitely not a consumer-friendly price tag. I'm not trying to justify that, but I get it. Years of researching, pulling back a product because something somewhere at some time could go wrong, and then redoing everything again, that takes time, costs a lot of money, and Nokia seems to be the type of company that just wants to optimize everything to the extreme. And that extreme comes with a price tag that is also a bit extreme. It's just hard to imagine that two coolers are not that far apart performance-wise, but one has a leading one in the price tag. But still, if you're looking for the best of the best, this seems so far to be the best one. You just need to decide if you're willing to spend that amount of money for a little bit better performance. But okay, this should be all for the brand new Noctua NH-D15 G2, the best air cooler as of right now, if the load is high enough. At this point, a huge thank you to Nokia for sending over all of these. Oh, on a side note, we have a Discord server, so if you want to join, the link is down below. And we got channel membership, so if you are planning to sell your soul for an RG poop emoji, that's one way to go. But if not, I'm also releasing the content to all members 2 or 3 weeks in advance. Except for the NDA stuff, cause you know, I don't want to get sued. Additionally, you can rest assured that the income will not only keep the channel afloat, but will also serve to start a petition requesting or demanding Nokia not to wait 5 years before they release the Chrome X Black version. Please? Anyway, thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and if you want to keep going, have a look at our take on the thermal rate cooler. Interesting to see how much performance you can actually squeeze out for not that much money. Hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.